All right, today we're diving into a source that presents a really different view of American Indian history. It basically takes a lot of the stories we learn in school and turns them on their head. So let's get right into it and unpack the main arguments.
So the source we're looking at kicks things off with a pretty bold question, and it's really the core of the whole argument. What if the story you think you know about the Trail of Tears is, well, mostly a myth? The whole idea here is that a lot of the narrative is actually a pretty modern invention.
And the first surprising claim is about the name itself. Get this. The source argues that the term Trail of Tears simply didn't exist at the time. It says that phrase only started getting popular in the early 1900s and didn't really become common until the 1960s. More than 100 years later.
Okay, so let's dig into the details the source uses to challenge that conventional story. It argues that if you just see it as a simple land grab, you're missing some really crucial context that it wants to bring to the table.
Now, a huge part of the Trail of the Tears story is, of course, the tragic death toll. We all hear the number 4,000, but this source says, hold on a second. It claims the real number is probably closer to 10% of that. It says that 4,000 number actually came from a missionary's letter, and even he later admitted it was based on hearsay and guesswork.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The financial side. The source claims the tribes weren't just ripped off. It points out that the U.S. government paid the Cherokee $5 million for 7 million acres. That's about 70 cents an acre. Now look at that compared to the Louisiana Purchase at 3 cents an acre, or Alaska at just 2 cents. It paints a very different picture.
And to really hammer this point home, the source includes this quote from President Andrew Jackson. He's basically saying that if the government offered American citizens the same deal, free land out west plus cash, they would have jumped at the chance. It suggests that, at the time, these were seen as incredibly generous terms.
Okay, so from there, the source moves on to confront what it calls the myth of the peaceful Indian. It argues that this idea of Native Americans living in some kind of perfect harmony before Columbus arrived is a modern fantasy that just ignores a much more violent reality.
It actually pulls up this data from an archaeologist, Lawrence Keeley. And the argument here is pretty straightforward. Across human history, so-called primitive societies were actually at war far more often, like 2/3 of the time, than more complex civilized states were.
And to back this up, the source points to hard archaeological evidence. We're talking about things like the Crow Creek Massacre, which happened centuries before Columbus, and the fact that almost every new village was being fortified. The point is, brutal warfare wasn't the exception, it was a constant part of life. And the source doesn't shy away from the grim details of this warfare. It points to 25 different archaeological sites in the American Southwest. This quote here describes what was found, and the anthropologists cited in the text say it's clear evidence of cannibalism between 900 and 1300 AD.
The source also argues that this violence was highly ritualized. It wasn't just about killing your enemy. It was about mutilating them in specific ways to damage them in the afterlife. It argues scalping was an ancient native custom and that different tribes had their own brutal traditions for dealing with their enemies.
Next up, the source tackles another huge one, the whole idea that America is built on stolen land. It really dissects this idea by asking a basic question about what property and ownership even meant to the different tribes.
So, according to the source, here's the fundamental contradiction. We often hear both of these claims, sometimes from the same people, but they can't both be true, right? If there's no concept of owning land, then how can it be stolen? The source argues that this is a logical trap.
And to argue that tribes absolutely did have a concept of territory, the source gives this example from the 1830s. It all started over an acorn grove. One tribe stole from another, which led to a massacre, and the winners ended up taking over the loser's land. The source says, what is that if not a war over property?
Okay, so the next big myth the source wants to bust is how the West was actually won. The common story is all about superior European technology. Guns against bows and arrows. Well, this source claims that for a very long time, the advantage was actually with the native warriors.
I mean, think about it. The source argues that for centuries, a warrior on horseback with a short bow was way deadlier than a soldier with a musket. A Comanche could fire off dozens of arrows with deadly accuracy while at a full gallop. Meanwhile, the poor U.S. soldier is fumbling to reload his single-shot rifle. It wasn't even a fair fight. And to prove this wasn't just a fluke, the source lists out several major, and I mean major, U.S. Army defeats. These weren't just small skirmishes. These were decisive victories for Native American forces that showed just how effective their way of fighting was.
So what changed? According to this text, the tide only turned when the U.S. Army finally gave up on its old European tactics. It had to learn to fight like its enemy, using native scouts, moving in small units, traveling at night, and waging total war on their resources, not just their warriors.
So in the end, the source concludes that the outcome wasn't decided by better soldiers or better guns, it was decided by things happening off the battlefield. The massive economic and logistical power of an industrial nation, the devastating and unintentional spread of disease, and the collapse of the bison herds, which was the entire foundation of the Plains tribe's way of life.
And this brings us to the final and most serious claim the source addresses, the charge of genocide. Now, this is obviously a huge and powerful accusation, and the text offers a very direct counterargument.
The key distinction the source makes here is between horrific atrocities and a systematic state-sponsored policy of extermination. It argues that while, yes, terrible massacres did happen, they weren't official policy. In fact, it claims they often led to public outrage and government condemnation when they came to light.
The source uses the Sand Creek Massacre as its prime example, an undeniable atrocity, no question. But it points out that the reaction was immediate condemnation. It was reported by the commander's own officers, it led to multiple investigations, the governor had to resign, and Congress officially called it a foul and dastardly massacre.
And to show the alternative to extermination, the source tells the story of Quanah Parker. It poses the question, if the goal was genocide, why would a fearsome enemy chief end up becoming a wealthy rancher, a lobbyist for his people, and even a friend of President Roosevelt?
So this source we've walked through today offers a major challenge to the standard history, forcing us to look at some uncomfortable arguments and question the stories we've been told. And it leaves us with one last thing to think about. You know the old saying, history is written by the victors. But maybe in an age like ours, the real question is, who gets to write the revisions?